Before we begin our journey on this tranquil night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're joining from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these ancient memories. What hangovers were like in medieval times. I remember that morning well, or at least the parts that remained, hazy between a dull throb in the back of my head and the sour smell that lingered in the chapel's corner. The harvest feast had been generous, as it rarely was, and the beer, brewed from the last summer batch, seemed to flow straight from the mug into laughter. We laughed loudly, danced in circles, and someone, I don't know who, played the flute with the boldness of a man who'd never known silence. But the next day had a different tune. A dull groan in the stomach, a buzzing swarm in the skull, and a faint yet persistent suspicion that I had vomited on Father Tomas's boots. I woke up in the stable, clinging to a sack of turnips and with a tongue drier than the Sunday sermon. Beside me, Geoffrey, the blacksmith, still snored, a sprig of parsley stuck in his beard like a charm against regret. No one spoke of hangovers back then, but we knew well when the body became a battlefield between bad wine and a guilty conscience. The elders had their cures, a thin garlic and turnip broth, a few nettle leaves under the tongue, and for the truly desperate, a quick confession before Mass. Not for forgiveness, but for the chance to sit in the shade of the confessional. But shade was a luxury that day. The sun had decided to punish fools, and we were all summoned to sweep the square. A collective penance that mixed labor and humiliation with the ease of those born under both divine and human law. My head throbbed with every toll of the bell, and even the crows seemed to laugh at our misery. Worse than the physical pain, however, was Sister Mariel's gaze, that frail nun with eyes like razors. She wandered among us with a bucket of holy water and a wooden spoon, giving out comforting pats and reciting psalms in Latin that somehow sounded like insults. They say wine reveals truth, but that morning all it revealed was who had the weakest stomach and the least resistance to shame. I prayed, as if that might erase the memory of having recited obscene verses from the pulpit, mistaking the psalm of the day for a tavern tune. Father Tomas, to my surprise, didn't scold me. He merely passed by with a damp cloth on his forehead and a sigh that said, "I've been where you are, my son." That was the comfort of the embarrassed, knowing that even saints once stumbled at the altar after one too many drinks. And then came the turnip. Always the turnip, diced into trembling cubes, boiled until it lost all traces of joy, and served in silence in the communal kitchen's clay bowls. They said it purified the blood, that it cooled the humors, but I always thought it was punishment disguised as medicine. Still, I ate every piece with the devotion of a penitent, eyes down, trying to ignore the whispers and muffled laughter from the laundress's corner. Nothing like vomiting on the altar to become local legend, for a week at least. In the village, everyone pretended to forget, but only after telling the story to at least 3 neighbors, 2 uncles, and a baker. Collective memory had a special talent for preserving other people's embarrassment in poetic detail. They said, I danced with the statue of St. Crispin, that I proposed to the miller's wife, and that I challenged the sacristan to a hymn duel. Exaggerations, of course, but the wine from the night before made it hard to argue with confidence. I just smiled, accepted the new nickname, Sir Hangover, and prayed that the next harvest would offer me dignity instead of more beer. As the days passed, the body recovered, though pride remained slightly crooked, like a poorly hung door. For many, the effects of the binge were physical. Headaches, rebellious stomachs, eyes burning in the sunlight. For me, it was the silence of the next morning that weighed the most. The absence of laughter, the long pause between good mornings, the way even the roosters seemed to crow with less enthusiasm. It was as if the world expected you to reflect, Not with guilt, but with that kind of calm regret that teaches gently to drink more wisely, or at least to vomit in less sacred places. On Saturday morning, the breeze felt fresher, or maybe it was just my forehead still damp from being dunked in the well. I was assigned to clean the altar. Irony or divine justice, I never knew for sure. The stone was stained not by me, but by countless feet, knees, and prayers that had touched it before. I worked slowly, in silence, feeling the weight of the bucket's wood, the cloth, and the occasional glance from the chapel's half-open door. But something in that task soothed me. There was no rush, no mockery, only the gentle slosh of water in the bucket and the scent of lavender and melted wax. As I scrubbed, I heard light footsteps and the soft clinking of a rosary. It was Sister Beatrice, who despite the veil always wore the face of someone who'd seen everything and survived with a firm smile. She sat at the back, not to watch over me, but perhaps to remind me that despite the shame, I was still part of the village, part of the story. "The altar isn't angry with you," she said, without looking directly at me. "But the lilies, they were offended." Then she laughed, the kind of laugh that doesn't judge, only shares the memory of times when one was also young and foolish, or still is. When I finished, the altar shone with a dignity I hadn't fully recovered. The sister stood, gave a small nod, and vanished down the corridor as if she'd never been there. I returned home with hands full of scratches and a heart slightly lighter. There was something redemptive in caring for what you'd helped ruin, as if, by cleaning the altar, I was also wiping away a bit of the excessive laughter, the poorly digested wine, and the swollen pride of the night before. The village carried on, indifferent and patient as old places do, waiting for you to learn, but in no hurry at all. In the days that followed, I returned to work with the shepherd. Sheep don't care about reputation, nor about what you said under the influence of mead. They simply follow, chew, sleep standing up, and sometimes rest their heads on your shoulder, as if to whisper, "This too shall pass." And it does. Even the taste of turnip, even the whispers in the square, even the memory of the altar. What remains are only faint traces, a story to be told in a hush by the hearth, a nickname that fades with time, and perhaps a new way of holding the mug, with more respect and less enthusiasm. At the next feast, I was more cautious. I declined the third cup with a shy smile and a discreet pat on the stomach. No one mocked me. In fact, some nodded quietly, like veterans well acquainted with the price of one night too long. I sat by the fire, listened to the songs, clapped off beat, and let the joy pass through me gently like a breeze instead of a storm. It was there, amid softer laughter and more spaced-out sips, that I realized even the hangover, with all its excess and punishment, is part of this dance we call living. And when, years later, I heard a young man stumble through a hymn during Mass after the harvest, I said nothing. I simply offered him water, fresh bread, and a patch of shade. Because everyone, at some point, stumbles over their own joys. And if there's any wisdom that medieval hangovers leave us with, it's this: the body heals with turnip and rest, but the spirit only calms with forgiveness, shared stories, and a second chance to make it home with dignity and your shoes still on. A day in the life of a medieval laundry worker. I wake to the sound of running water, not the soft kind that cradles dreams, but the firm, unrelenting gurgle of the cold stream, already carrying with it promises of soap, secrets, and numb fingers. The sun is still stretching behind the clouds as I pick up my laundry basket. It's heavy. It always is. And yet, there's something comforting in that weight. The murmurs of other people's clothes, still warm from the bodies that wore them. I am a washerwoman, daughter of a washerwoman, granddaughter of a woman who knew every kind of knot, stain, and lie that fabric could hold. The path to the river is familiar, lined with footprints and whispers, and the morning air bites, but it also awakens. The stones by the riverside are smooth from use, shaped by decades of bent knees, of hands that wring, beat and scrub as if they could wash away not only the dirt, but the stories clinging to it. Each piece of linen, wool or cotton brings more than sweat. There are traces of cheap perfume, stains that defy explanation, seams stitched in haste, and we who wash see it all. It's not that we talk, at least, not always. But between a bar of ash soap and another of aged tallow, sometimes tongues loosen. And in the waters back and forth, there are low chuckles and eyes that meet in shared understanding. Because here, unlike the stone halls of the nobility, truth is finally allowed to breathe. Washing the clothes of common folk is a kind of comfort. They're predictable. The men's shirts, stiff from labor. The girls' dresses, stained with mud and sweetness. But some days, fabrics arrive that are far too fine for this world. Shrunken silks, embroidery marked with initials that demand silence, hems heavy not just with thread, but with hidden intentions. Washing them is a risk. A thread pulled in the wrong place can bring dangerous questions. I've seen washerwomen disappear after letting slip the name embroidered on a nightshirt. And even so, we take the job, because coins are scarce and mouths are many. The water freezes the bones before mid-morning. Fingers swell, redden, stiffen like wet wood. And still, they know what to do. They dive, scrub, beat fabric against stone in a rhythm that sounds like prayer. Some of us sing to fend off the weariness. Others just murmur, as if each garment had the right to be heard, while its marks fade away. Every now and then, a thicker foam rises to the surface, carrying something unnamed, a memory, a regret, or maybe just the lingering scent of an expensive perfume poorly hidden. Among washerwomen, there's a hierarchy no one teaches, but all of us know. The older ones no longer wash children's clothes. They've earned the right to rest their knees and slender arms. The new girls take the heaviest loads, grimy aprons, travel cloaks. And those who know how to keep their mouths shut, those receive the gowns from the salons, the sheets from beds that don't smell of sleep. I, whether by luck or silence, belong to that last group. I've scrubbed stains that weren't wine, undone knots that bound more than fabric, found notes sewn in threads so fine they felt like sighs. There's a moment, always around midday, when the sun touches the water and everything takes on a golden, almost magical glow. The stream reflects our tired faces as if offering comfort. And for a brief instant, it's possible to forget the aching backs and the blisters tearing through our fingers. The clothes dry around us, hung on makeshift lines or draped over shrubs, fluttering in the wind like flags from silent battles. Some carry perfume, others secrets, but all, in the end, become just clean fabric. It's strange to think that the same dress I washed today will be used for dancing tonight, at feasts we're never invited to. From time to time, a visitor appears. A nervous servant, a lady with her hood pulled low, or even a man with boots far too polished for this kind of mud. They bring clothes wrapped in dark cloths and don't wait for receipts. They pay well, but rarely meet our eyes. We know what that means. In those moments, our hands keep moving, but our thoughts stand guard like sentries. No one asks anything, but no one forgets either, because every piece of fabric tells a story, and we are the keepers of what is spoken only in stains, folds, and seams. Yes, we are washerwomen, but we are also the memory of all that others wish would vanish with the running water. In the afternoon, when the wind starts to shift and the scent of burning wood escapes from nearby homes, it's time to wring out the final load. Arms ache, fabrics weigh heavy, and even so, there is a strange beauty in the finished work. The clean clothes return to their baskets, folded with care, even when we know they'll never belong to us. In each fold, we leave a bit of ourselves, our effort, our silence, our part in someone else's life that will never be acknowledged. There is something ritualistic in this return, as if we're handing back a new chance to the world, piece by piece, knowing full well it will all get dirty again. On the way back, we cross the village with our baskets now light and the clothes clinging to our still damp bodies. The children look at us with curiosity, the men glance away, and the other women, well, they know. They know what it means to spend a day by the river, with knees marked by stone and hearts full of stories that must not be told. Sometimes, one of them asks quietly if we wash the clothes of someone in particular. We reply with a half smile and a shrug. Because in our craft, washing is also keeping, and there are reputations worth more than coins. When I finally get home, my body feels made of stone, but it's a good tired, the kind that comes from honest, if invisible, work. I hang my wet tunic by the fire, massage my shoulders with cheap oil, and watch the flames dance as if they wanted to erase what I saw and heard throughout the day. But the images remain. The ribbon hidden in a dress hem, the whisper between two washerwomen, the loose note in the lining of a shirt that read simply, "Wait for me." Every detail stitches itself into my memory like a fine seam, discreet, but impossible to undo. And so, night falls over the village like a soft blanket, hiding the marks of the day. Outside, the river keeps running, indifferent, carrying away soap, sweat, and secrets. Tomorrow, I'll be there again, barefoot in the mud, hands plunged into the cold current, washing the world once more, or at least trying, because deep down, we are all a bit like those clothes, stained, worn, but still worthy of care. And if there's any magic in this craft, it lies precisely in that, in giving back to the world what many would have already thrown away. Clean, silent, and ready to begin again. What going to the bathhouse was like in medieval times. I remember clearly a cold afternoon when I walked to the village's stone bathhouse with the autumn breeze pushing dry leaves across the cobblestones. The sun was already sinking behind the hills, and chimney smoke danced in the pale sky, perfuming the air with damp firewood and burning rosemary. I carried with me a small linen pouch. Inside, grey soap made from fat and ash, a few dried sage leaves, and a worn coin, paid not only for the warmth of the water, but for the illusion of forgetting for an hour or two, the calluses of labour and the dust of the roads. The bathhouse stood at the edge of the old wall, between the tavern and the communal granary, a low stone building, damp and unassuming, with a heavy door that creaked like an old dog stretching. Upon entering, the steam enveloped me like a warm embrace, dense and moist, carrying the scent of skin, rough soap, and a faint touch of wild eucalyptus. Inside, voices spoke low, as if the stone walls already knew too much. It was a place of respectful silence, where bodies undressed in the mist, but words hesitated. After all, it's easy to wash away dirt, harder to undress one's composure in front of neighbors who'd share your pew at Sunday Mass. There was something ritualistic in that steamy space. The slow gestures of rubbing arms with linen sponges, the calloused hands pouring hot water over bent shoulders, the creak of planks beneath bare feet. Elderly women murmured recipes to lighten skin spots. Young girls stifled shy giggles behind their towels. And there was always a sharp-eyed midwife mixing herbs into steaming basins like she was brewing a domestic spell against winter aches. The water, though murky, carried more than dirt. It washed away a little of the weight of the days. Unwritten rules shaped that misty world. Don't stare for too long, don't speak too loud, and never ask why so-and-so only comes to bathe after sunset. The more modest wore thin tunics that clung like second skin. Others found strange freedom in being naked among strangers. Occasionally, glances crossed, brief, uneasy, between the miller's daughter and the blacksmith's wife, as if both were trying to remember whether they'd gossiped about each other at the market. Yet amidst that discreet tension, there was a delicate communion. Everyone there was seeking the same thing: warmth, cleansing, and maybe a moment of peace. Some afternoons, a woman with trembling hands brought a small vial of scented oil, lavender perhaps, or marjoram, and anointed her shoulders with devotional care, as if preparing to meet something greater than the daily grind. It was common to find on the damp benches small cloths with mallow leaves, elderflowers, or even handfuls of coarse salt mixed with dried orange peel. Each carried their own secrets of purification, not just of the body, but of the soul, worn by the season's trials. And there were the whispers, always the whispers. The steam didn't muffle voices as one might expect, it merely made them more mysterious. Conversations slid along the damp walls like drops of condensation. A rumor about the new monk, a disguised comment about the baker's wound, or a far-fetched theory on why the apothecary's daughter spent so much time in the bathhouse's back room. No one admitted to listening, but everyone heard. It was a shared murmur, carried between water mirrors and tense silence, and so the bath became a social rite too, where bodies were washed while stories built up like forgotten suds on the basin's rim. I recall once an old merchant from Bruges entering with a small linen bundle. He sat in a corner, unwrapped it with the care of someone handling a relic, and revealed a darkened pumice stone. "Volcanic lava from southern lands," he whispered, as if sharing a secret. He passed it over his heels with solemnity, and for a moment even the whispers ceased, as if everyone had understood that that simple, meticulous gesture, was the only prayer the man had ever known. And as the steam filled the cracks in the ceiling, and the heat made the walls sweat alongside the bodies, there came a moment when the outside world seemed to melt into the mist. No tax, no failed harvest, no letter from the feudal lord could pierce that humid barrier. For a brief while we were all equal, nobles and servants, washerwomen and housewives, old and young, united not by fate, but by the shared effort to find comfort in a world of dust, cold and mistrust. Sometimes at the end of the bath, some would remain seated for long minutes in silence, wrapped in coarse cloths, watching the soft ripples of the hot water as it cooled. It was a silence unlike that of the churches, not sacred, but intimate, as if in that rarefied space between steam and stone, body fatigue and mental stillness reached a truce. Outside, the world remained the same, harsh, unpredictable, often cruel. But inside, while the last drops ran down our hair and across the planks of the floor, something within us softened. We always left the bathhouse a little lighter, not just from clean skin or relaxed muscles, but from the silent sharing of a routine that reminded us that despite our differences, we all sought shelter beneath the same smoky roof. And when the wooden door closed behind us and the night air kissed our still damp skin, we knew we hadn't just taken a bath. We had visited a sanctuary, strange, warm, sometimes uncomfortable, where tired bodies found at last a kind of relief without promises, yet full of humanity. How people cheated at medieval games. It was on a night soaked in mist and murmurs that I sat once more in the back of a tavern, forgotten by maps. The wooden bench creaked beneath my weight, as if it too remembered winters long gone. The hearth crackled lazily, casting long shadows on the darkened walls. Around me, voices wove together in a chorus of hoarse laughter, muffled curses, and mugs clinking like old friends. At the center of it all, a game. Bone dice, worn at the edges. A stained deck of cards, touched by more hands than the market's bread. And among the players, half-covered faces, wary smiles, and that invisible tension that only surfaces when there are too many coins on the table, or too much pride at stake. As the night wore on, it became clear the true masters at the table weren't the luckiest, but the quietest. There was an old man with a short beard and fingers as thin as nails, who rolled the dice so gently they seemed to float through the air by will alone. Another, with sharp eyes, handled the cards with the finesse of someone who had trained more with tricks than with prayers, and everyone pretended not to notice. Because in a medieval tavern, winning too much was dangerous, but losing with outrage was worse. The secret was to win like it was a draw, smile like you'd lost, and pocket the prize before anyone realized just how good you really were. I remember especially a man named Harlan, missing his front teeth, who laughed like someone who had once wagered his soul and either won or lost. He claimed to have learned how to cheat from a retired monk, which might have been true if we consider that some monks knew more about wine and cards than psalms. Harlan used a light die, carved from deer bone, with a tiny lead weight hidden inside. On bolder nights, he would let the die accidentally fall from the table, just to swap it with another hidden in his boot. And when he won, he toasted generously, his way of buying silence. For every seasoned cheat knew that sharing the joy was safer than flaunting the victory. Not everyone was so subtle. There were the impulsive ones, too young, too confident, who marked cards with a fingernail or hid aces in the frayed sleeves of their cloaks. Some managed to fool others for a round or two, maybe even walk away with a few extra coins and a cocky grin. But the tavern's eyes saw more than they let on. The tavern keeper, a woman named Edith, with the arms of a baker and the patience of a weary nun, could spot a cheat before they even sat down. And though her tavern had no written rules, everyone understood there was an invisible line. Cheating was tolerated, disrespecting the room was not. One particularly rowdy night, I saw a boy try to bluff with such arrogance that he failed to notice the man across from him. A former soldier, still soaked from the rain, fingers marked by battle and steel. At the first hint of deceit, the die flew, but the fist came faster. The table flipped, mugs fell like drunken witnesses. In the end, the boy left with a few more coins and one less tooth. Right there, he learned the old unwritten rule of tavern games. Cheating is an art. Surviving it, now that's a separate talent. After that, the games resumed as always, with guarded smiles, quick hands, and an almost ritualistic respect for the mystery of chance. Some players carried small talismans, a hold coin, an owl feather, a smooth stone kept in a pocket. They swore they brought luck, but perhaps they were just reminders of nights when fortune smiled and then bit. An older man, who played more to observe than to win, once said that dice were like fate. They could be cast with cunning, but in the end, it was the silence between the rolls that told the real story. The best cheats, the truly memorable ones, were those who knew how to lose gracefully and win discreetly. A nod of the head, a humble murmur, a quiet gesture to share the winnings with the tavern keeper. Because in a medieval tavern, reputation traveled faster than a rested horse, and a name spoken with respect was worth more than a purse full of coin. A well-done cheat was less a deception and more a dance between skill, risk, and the delicate balance of leaving before the lantern started to flicker with suspicion. Over time, I learned to recognize the signs. A glance cast too quickly, a card folded ever so slightly, a die that spun just a bit too slowly. But I also learned that pointing fingers wasn't always wise. Sometimes the game was only the backdrop for deeper stories. A man betting his last coin from a failed harvest, another trying to forget a recent war, a woman gambling with laughter to silence her longing. In those cases, cheating wasn't malice, it was survival, a way of bending reality for a moment, of making fate feel a little more forgiving. There were nights when no one won much, and no one lost too hard. The dice rolled, the cards danced, and the real prize was the warmth of the hearth, the sound of thunder in the distance, and the unspoken feeling that, for a few hours, everyone was protected by the smoke and the noise. When the tavern emptied and only the embers crackled, with the old deck still resting on the table, it became clear these games, honest or not, weren't just about winning. They were about being there, about belonging to the night, even if just briefly, like another thread in the frayed, precious tapestry of that world of creaks, laughter, and shadows. And so, when the early morning finally stretched over the crooked rooftops, and the sounds of the tavern gave way to the whisper of the wind, all that remained was the memory of the game, or perhaps the theatre, that had unfolded between drinks and wagers. The table, now silent, bore the marks of the night. Mug rings, crumbs of hard bread, and sometimes a forgotten card, face down, like a secret that chose to remain hidden. I would rise slowly, my knees protesting, and cast one last glance at the place where laughter, lies, and small victories had woven together like threads in a dusty, tattered, but treasured tapestry. As I walked home, wrapped in fog and the lingering scent of smoke and barley, I thought about how those games, and even their tricks, had the power to bring together souls that might otherwise never have spoken. Deep down, the art of cheating without punishment was less about the trick itself and more about balance, knowing when to smile, when to stay silent, when to offer a drink to your opponent before they noticed the hidden card. And even now, so many winters later, when the dice no longer roll and the hands no longer tremble with anticipation, I carry with me the memory of those gatherings, not for the prizes won, but for the warmth shared between strangers, in the gentle dimness of an old tavern, what breakfast was like for different classes in medieval times. I remember it well, that first light slipping through the cracks of the stable, the cold ashes of the hearth slowly reigniting, and the sound of stale bread being broken with more faith than strength. In my youth, when dew still rested upon the fields and the silence of dawn was broken only by the snorting of cows, breakfast wasn't a meal, it was a rite of passage. For us peasants, it arrived not with abundance, but with necessity. A piece of dark bread, hard as wood, soaked in weak beer, not for taste but for lack of clean water. Sometimes a warm, unsalted oat porridge, stirred slowly and shared among many. It wasn't much, but it was something. And before the first bite, there was always a prayer, not for plenty, but for endurance. Now and then, on more generous mornings, a bit of hardened cheese or a forgotten egg from the hen might appear on the table. If we could even call that warped board a table. I remember the smell of porridge cooked in haste, the timid steam rising from a cracked clay bowl, and the quiet between siblings as we chewed slowly, as if that brief, simple moment was sacred. It was food that never fully satisfied the body, but was enough for the rhythm of life. And even on days when there were no more than crumbs, there was always a song, a story whispered between spoons, as if the spirit too needed feeding. In the monasteries, dawn came with the measured sound of prayers and the clink of wooden spoons against the bottoms of clay dishes. The monks, wrapped in coarse robes, followed their discipline with the same constancy as their psalms. Breakfast was simple, but reliable. Barley bread, a portion of thin porridge, and if the abbey was blessed with any extra gift, perhaps a handful of dried plums or a bit of salted butter. Silence at the table was absolute, broken only by the quiet chewing and the wind whistling outside. For them, eating was an extension of prayer, an act of humility, done with lowered eyes and attentive spirit. Ah, but the nobles. They awoke to the aromas of preparations already underway. Their mornings were announced not by a rooster's crow, but by the clinking of silverware being arranged on long oak tables. I recall a visit many years ago to a sunlit hall where breakfast looked more like a midday feast. There was white bread, soft and lightly toasted, fruits in syrup, eggs cooked with herbs, cured meats, and for the wealthiest, sweet wine or a cup of warm mead to rouse the spirit. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, and the dogs dozed at their master's feet while the lords and ladies, still in embroidered nightrobes, savoured every bite with a nearly ceremonial calm. There the morning meal was pleasure and status. Among the social layers, the contrast was nearly an abyss. While nobles discussed hunting and politics over steaming plates, the urban poor, the beggars who roamed the narrow, damp alleys, had little or nothing. They awoke with bellies as empty as their pockets, and their first meal, if it came, was earned through pleading or luck. A scrap of bread donated by a tavern, a withered apple fallen from a cart, or a sip of thin broth offered by a kind soul. For them, dawn brought no aromas or flavors, only the repetition of hope. And yet many of these poor had the habit of giving thanks, not for what they received, but simply for being alive to seek another day. Curious how even the absence of food could shape the spirit. Those with little learned to savor time itself, to take comfort in the warmth of a shy sunbeam or a stone bench warmed by the morning. An old man once told me his favorite breakfast was silence, because in that silence he could imagine any meal. And perhaps in a way, he was right. Imagination feeds in ways that hunger can never quite extinguish. Even with empty hands, he smiled, remembering the times when a handful of chestnuts or a chunk of stale bread were still within reach. Out in the fields, among the more fortunate peasants, a market day or a good harvest could bring surprise. A carefully boiled egg, a sprinkle of fresh scallion over the porridge, or even a sliver of salted meat sliced thin as paper. On such occasions, they ate slowly, as if prolonging the pleasure were a way to resist oblivion. And when the meal was more generous, they shared it with a neighbor, with a stray orphan, with the old man who had no one. For even in scarcity, there was generosity. And in every act of sharing, the sense of community was reborn, a kind of abundance that lived not in the food, but in the gesture. That spirit of sharing was what stitched life together in the countryside, like a blanket mended by patient hands. I remember one especially harsh winter when firewood was scarce and bread almost a luxury. Even so, my mother broke her last slice in half to offer it to a snow-covered traveler who could barely speak from the cold. She used to say that sometimes the soul needed more than the body, and that half a shared loaf was worth more than a banquet eaten alone. On those freezing mornings, the ember in the stove and the kindness in the house seemed to warm more than any bowl of porridge ever could. Meanwhile, in the monastery kitchens, where the rhythm followed the bell, not the sun, the morning meal was a rehearsal in restraint. They ate in complete silence, their gaze turned inward, as if they were chewing through their thoughts as well. The tables were long, the benches hard, and the bread rationed in mathematically precise portions. Nothing was wasted, not the crumbs, not the time. And still, there was beauty in that simplicity. A quiet beauty, made of discipline and purpose, like the filtered light through narrow chapel windows resting gently upon the calm hands of the brothers. Sometimes, a more worldly visitor would find the sobriety strange. "Is this it?" they'd ask, looking at the bowl of porridge and the mug of warm water. But the monks would smile, serene, like those who had long since learned that the body needs little when the spirit is full. They'd say that fasting in the morning left space for listening to oneself, to silence, to God. And perhaps they were right. For in that sacred dimness, each bite held a meaning no banquet could ever contain. And what about the nobles? Nobles didn't just eat. They breakfasted with theatrical flair. It was common for their first meal to be served in their chambers on a tray with carved edges, accompanied by silent attendants awaiting orders. Dried fruits, soft cheeses, eggs scented with herbs, delicate breads, and sometimes even cold game meats, all arranged with the care of those who turn eating into performance. And to drink, diluted wine or warm mead, served in pewter goblets. The meal was leisurely, punctuated by light conversation or quiet reading, while beyond the windows, the ordinary world stirred in mud and smoke. Even among the nobility there were distinctions. Some preferred the noisy abundance of the great hall, where family and guests gathered around long, polished wooden tables, surrounded by tapestries that dulled the chill of stone. There, breakfast took on a celebratory tone. Rich pâté spread over fresh bread, smoked fish, candied fruits, toasted nuts, all accompanied by the clinking of silverware and the discreet laughter of those who already knew the day would smile upon them. Others, more reserved, ate in silence, savoring the details, the steam rising from a bowl, the golden gleam of honey dripping onto bread, the crackle of butter touching a hot surface. And yet it didn't matter how vast the hall or how humble the hut. All mornings began with the same ancestral gesture: to sit, to chew slowly, to gaze upon the day unfolding beyond. In every corner of the realm, from stone to palace, there was a pause before labor, a moment when food met the still sleeping soul. And even those who had no bread, no porridge, no fire, would still lift their eyes to the sky and murmur something, a prayer perhaps, or simply a sigh, as if recognizing in the mere act of waking a gift. And that gift, however small, was treasured, because hunger in those times was like the wind. It touched everyone but blew harder against some. I once met an old man who told me his most memorable breakfast was on a morning with no food at all. "I had only the sun on my face and the silence around me," he said, "but I felt a kind of fullness I've never known since." He didn't say it with sadness, but with the peace that only those who have lost much seem to carry. To him, that moment without bread was more than absence. It was remembrance, the presence of what truly mattered. With time, I learned that the true flavor of medieval breakfast wasn't just in the food, but in the company, in the shared silences, in the scent of hay all around, in the steam rising from simple bowls, in the hope renewed with each beam of light filtered through cracks. Eating was an act of continuity, a way of saying, "We are still here." And whether with sweet wine or thin soup, with herbed eggs or hardened crumbs, each class, each soul, found a way to begin the day with whatever was at hand, but always with a mindful heart. Because even in harsh times, the first food of the day was, above all, a whisper of life. And so the day began, with the clinking of spoons, the crackle of fire, or the subtle rumble of empty stomachs. Each person found their rhythm, their way of moving forward. There was no rush, only the inevitable pace of routine, milking the goats, sweeping the yard, slipping on boots still wet with dew. Breakfast, however modest, was a starting point, a silent promise that somehow there would be sustenance. And even when the bread was dry and the broth watery, that moment contained the seed of something greater: perseverance. Today, when I close my eyes, I can still sense the faint scent of slowly cooking oats, the rough feel of a clay mug between cold fingers, and the soft sounds of ancient voices murmuring the first words of the day. I remember a morning when my sister giggled quietly upon finding a hidden plum at the bottom of her bowl, a small joy that changed the entire day. Because at heart, that's what medieval breakfasts were best at, stitching life's hardships with threads of tenderness, turning scarcity into ritual, and reminding us, always, that even the humblest piece of bread can become a feast when shared with warmth. And perhaps that's why these memories still walk beside me, not for what we ate, but for how we felt while eating. The world was harsh, yes, but there were moments when it felt suspended, as if the weight of existence dissolved in the steam rising from a bowl, or in the smile of someone beside you. I recall mornings when we split a single egg 4 ways, and no one complained. There was care in that gesture, as if each half were gold, and around the table, even when there was no table, we felt we belonged to one another. Now, with the passing of years, I realized that medieval breakfast was, above all, a mirror reflecting the soul of its time, its inequalities, yes, but also its tenderness. For the rich, a banquet. For the monks, an offering. For the poor, a hope. And for the forgotten, a whispered prayer to the wind, perhaps wordless but full of faith. Each spoonful, each bite, each absence of food, all of it said, there is still a day ahead. And that, in those times, was already a miracle. And when day finally stretched across the fields, the monasteries, and the stone cities, each person went on their way with whatever they had received, whether a warm loaf fresh from the oven or just the warmth of a good memory. Because breakfast didn't end with the last bite, but continued in the steps that followed, in the way one embraced the day's work, in how one looked up at the sky. It was a small, intimate ceremony, a pause between sleep and labor, where body and spirit met, even if only for a moment, in balance. And it is in that very moment that my memory rests tonight, in the silence before the bell rings, in the sound of bread being broken, in the hearth smoke slowly fading into the air. For in those days, so full of harsh noises and heavy tasks, there were also pockets of softness, of sweetness, hidden between the hours. An egg for the rich, a prayer for the poor. And in both, the same ancestral gesture to nourish oneself in order to go on. Because in the end, whether with a banquet or a thread of hope, we all awoke with the same desire to stay alive one more day, with hearts warmed by something simple and quiet. And so, as the sun rose over the villages and fortresses, carrying with it the steam of kitchens and the first murmurs of the day, life began again. The child who woke with an empty belly ran to the barn in hopes of finding a little warm milk. The old shepherd broke his crust of bread into 4 pieces, as he always did, even when eating alone. And the girl, caring for her younger siblings, hummed softly while stirring the porridge in the pot, as if soothing the silence with tenderness. Each gesture, however small, was a form of love, even in times when love went unspoken. And perhaps that's why, even now, so many centuries later, when I remember those breakfasts, what returns to my mind is not the hunger nor the hardship, but the hidden beauty. The beauty of smoke dancing in the morning light, of wooden spoons gently clinking, of hands reaching toward one another. Because in every class, in every corner, there was an invisible thread that bound us, the desire to begin the day with dignity, with courage, and above all, with a little warmth, whether from fire, from food, or from affection. And it is with that memory that I now close my eyes and let the medieval morning rest in peace. And in that peace everything feels lighter, even the memories that once carried the weight of scarcity now gleam with a kind of gentle gold, like sunlight filtered through stained glass. I see again those tired but kind faces gathered around the shared bowl. My grandmother's watchful eyes as she broke the bread, as if she was sharing her strength with each piece. I see the steam rising from the porridge, drawing shapes in the cold air, and hear the whisper of prayers before the first spoonful. There was, in that moment, a kind of reverence, not for the food itself, but for the life that still pulsed within us. And so, even on mornings when there was nothing but silence and wind, there was also the quiet certainty that someone, somewhere, was beginning their day in the same way, with a small, silent hope, like an ember beneath the ash. Because that was the medieval breakfast, a gesture of continuity, a calm affirmation that, between wars and winters, between walls and fields, between palaces and huts, the world kept going, bite by bite, day by day. And now, as sleep approaches and the night carries us gently, may this old memory warm your heart too, like good bread, still warm, in the hands of one who waits. Good night.